Hello everybody. I hope you guys all are having or had a great spring break, and you'll want to have listened to this lecture before our Tuesday lecture. We left off last time just touching on the homunculus, which is the little man caricature. And so here's your map. They had in blue the primary motor cortex, which was the precentral gyrus. That was this side of the picture over here, like that. And on the pinkish red peach side of it, we had the primary somatosensory cortex, which is on the post-central gyrus. So precentral is motor, post-central is sensory. And this is how our body is laid out motor-wise or sensory-wise. So we're going to say motor on the precentral. So if we take an electrical probe and touch an area of the precentral gyrus, stimulating that area, we would elicit a motor activity from that area. And on the post-central gyrus, we could stimulate an area, and this is where we would feel it or appreciate it or kind of get a sense of what's going on the sensory side. So basically, if you were to look at the feet, they're found deep on the inside of the longitudinal fissure area. So we have big feet on the sensory side, but smaller feet on the motor side, because we have sensory areas on the feet. You guys have, I have at least, sensitive feet. This picture doesn't really show it as obvious, so that's why I mentioned you might want to look online and look up homunculus and see what those pictures kind of depict. I think it'll be a little more obvious if you look at those pictures versus the one that the textbook gave you. So the size that is depicted or is seen on these pictures are in relationship to how much innervation is in that area. So a lot of sensory for hands and face and tongue, and there'll be a lot for motor for different parts as well. So just take a peek at what the homunculus is. It'll give you a better idea of motor versus sensory. And if we look at, it said motor areas, primary, go away. Primary associated with the frontal lobe, so primary or somatic motor cortex is the major voluntary control located within the precentral gyrus. If we look at premotor cortex, anterior to the primary motor cortex, it's a staging area for learned or skilled motor activities. So these are things, when it says learned, it means that we had to actually learn how to do these activities, and we store them in our memory bank. So this is the memory bank for learned motor skills. And it's like a bank because you can access this and be able to utilize it. So this would help you plan activities, so this could be if you learned how to type, so typing skills, texting, playing the piano, other instruments, that type of thing. So you had to learn how to do these. If we look at Broca's area, it says it's anterior to inferior region of the premotor cortex. So special motor areas that directs coordinated activities of muscles for speech. So if we go back up here to that picture here, so here was our central sulcus, which we'll talk about a few different times. And here is your premotor cortex. Here is, or precentral gyrus and a post-central gyrus. And Broca's area is going to be here. So I'll put a B for that, Broca's area. And in a second, so we don't have to flip back and forth, I'm going to be talking about Wernicke's area. So I'll put a W there for Wernicke, and we'll see that in just a moment. I'm going to scroll back down, but I wanted you to see where Broca's is anterior to the pre-central gyrus. Wernicke's is posterior to the posterior central gyrus. And so it said Broca's area, special motor area that directs coordinated activity of muscles for speech. So this is also for articulation and vocalization. So if you have damage to Broca's area, it would impact your ability to be able to vocalize or verbalize what you want to say or do. So you might know what something means, but this would be the area that allows you to actually do it and say it and speak it. If we look at sensory areas, this is distributed in the parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes, okay? So primary somatosensory cortex is the parietal postcentral gyrus. Most sensory information comes here, and so this would be that sensory part of the map on the homunculus. I'll put sensory map when you're looking at the homunculus. So that's why it says postcentral gyrus, the sensory side of it. Also, we have the somatosensory association cortex, which is posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex. It provides an understanding or integration of simple sensory stimuli. So when we say the word association, it's talking about integration, making connections and understandings. So for example, if you were to have some coins in your pocket, and without seeing it visually with your eyes, you just put your hand in your pocket, you could feel the difference between, say, a penny and a dime, or a penny and a quarter, which might seem very obvious to you because you don't remember having to figure this kind of information out. But if somebody had damage to this area, they would not know the difference between the penny and the dime in their pocket until they brought it out and physically looked with their eyes and could see the difference that way. So you are feeling differences, but you can't make that association in your brain of what it is. So this is info stored in the somatosensory association cortex, gives you the understanding. So you could, for example, feel that difference between the penny and the dime without seeing it. So damage to the area would mean that you wouldn't be able to recognize the difference without visually seeing it and trying to make that association at that point. So you don't have the association. That's why that's important. The cortex also has visual, auditory, which is for hearing, olfactory is for smell, and gustatory is for taste. So you have visual, auditory, olfactory, and gustatory centers. So these are special sense areas, and we really get into talking about special senses when we, the very beginning of 228. So that's why we don't go into a lot of detail here, but the occipital area would be for vision, temporal area would be like hearing, taste, facial recognition even. So if we look at functional brain regions, so this receives many sensory inputs and sends output to multiple motor areas. So this is what we have to do, is decide what to do with the incoming information or stimuli and then generate an appropriate motor or output response. So we have to decide what to do, see what the line is, with incoming stimuli, that's the sensory part, right? And then we have to generate the appropriate motor output or response. So for example, something happens, you get some sort of sensation that comes in, and you have to generate the appropriate motor or output response. So it might be the cup is tipping over, you visually see this, so you have a sensory input of, oh my gosh, that's falling over, what do? Your brain decides, I think I will try to grab it. And so an appropriate motor response would be reach out and grab the cup. But if you had a different response, like sensory information came in, and instead of, I need to reach out and grab the cup, your brain goes, oh, let's run around the cup. That would not be appropriate. So you had a motor output, but it wasn't the right kind. That's a problem, right? So that's what we're talking about here. So with the prefrontal cortex, this is the most complex region of your brain. Okay, this is what makes you you. This is your intellect. This is for complex learning. This is for recall, your personality. And this area matures slowly. It's heavily dependent upon experiences. And so that could be positive or negative life experiences, right? A negative might be you touch the hot pot. Now that you know that, you realize something on the stove could potentially be hot. You had to learn that maybe by touching it. But later, you don't have to learn it again. You can draw on these other responses, which we kind of talked about before. So part of this maturing slowly is that it's also the last area to myelinate. And what we mean by that is myelination doesn't complete or finish until about your mid to late 20s. So myelination will start posteriorly in the occipital region, and then it will move anteriorly to the prefrontal cortex for the final myelinated area and maturation, or becoming mature. So what this means is the more connections that you can make while you're still young, because you're still growing, you're getting life experiences, you're learning how to survive to an extent, right? And that's the last area that matures and gets myelination. Thus, the more connections you make and then it myelinates, you kind of set it up at that point. So if you don't make a whole lot of connections while you're younger and then it finishes myelinating, you guys realize sometimes how difficult it is to learn things as we get older. And yet we're like sponges when we're 5 years old, and so on and so forth. So that's what we're talking about on last area to myelinate, matures slowly, but this is good because we want to learn more of these life experiences before we finally myelinate it and finish it off. Gnostic area, so the G is silent. Gnostic is talking about temporal, parietal, and occipital areas. It's the storage site for complex memory. So this is our knowledge area. So it's a storage site for complex memory patterns associated with sensations. So this is how we know things without the experience. S with a line is without. Know things without experience. So I know that sounds kind of weird, but for example, let's say you have a beaker of water versus a beaker of acid. So you're in a chemistry lab and both water and acid or a strong base, either way, but either one are both clear liquids. So you may not know which one is which, but you know that if you were to drop or break a glass of water and it splashes all over you, you wouldn't be afraid. But if you were to break a glass of acid on you, you'd probably be afraid and have a much different response, knowing that it's acid and that it could burn you, okay? So that's what we're talking about here. You didn't have to have the acid poured all over your body to know that that could be very dangerous and detrimental to your body physically and probably mentally after that happens. So this allows for recognition of patterns. So recognition of patterns and even faces. Okay, so this is having to do mostly with the temporal lobe and occipital lobe. So this is the area that if you had it damaged, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference or understand that that beaker of acid could burn you versus a beaker of water. You wouldn't make that association. If things are intact, again, like I said, you don't have to be poured acid on your body to understand that that would be dangerous and try to back away when something drops like that in a chemistry lab. As far as recognition of faces, so for example, if you had damage to the Gnostic area, you would not be able to recognize somebody. So you had learned at some point who they were, maybe they're a friend, maybe they're a family member, but if this area got damaged, you know, maybe there was a stroke or trauma to that part of the brain, you wouldn't recognize their face. So you'd see a face, but you can't make that association of who they were or what they mean to you at that point. So let's see. Also, let's go to Wernicke's area. This is the W that I circled on the brain a second ago. So you had Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is understanding written and spoken language. So this is your language area. And it's understanding what you want to do in response to the written or spoken language. So when you read a word, it's Wernicke's area that helps you understand what that word meant. So Broca's area is responsible for our articulation, but Wernicke's is responsible for the language. So the ability to understand that written or spoken word to create a response. So if you had damage to Wernicke's area, you would tell the person what to do and they don't understand what you want them to do. You could write it down and they still wouldn't understand what you wanted them to do. So if they had a stroke and it affected Wernicke's area, it doesn't matter if you spoke to them and told them you want them to do something, or if you wrote it down and they read it, they wouldn't understand. It's lost that association part of it, okay? If you had damage to Broca's area, they could read and understand the information, and they know what they want to say to you, to articulate the words and speak to you about it, but they wouldn't be able to say the words to you. Okay, that's the difference between Broca's and Wernicke's. And it's really fascinating, not fun, but it is fascinating to see, you know, when somebody's had a stroke, what area of the brain has been damaged because of this. So my grandmother had had a stroke, and it was interesting, you know, not fun, like I said, but she could understand exactly what she wanted to say, but she couldn't get the words out verbiage-wise to tell the nurse or somebody else what was going on. And then people assume that if you can't speak that you don't know what's happening, but she could read, she knew what was going on, and when she regained her ability to write things down, she could write down what she wanted. So she had no damage to Wernicke's area, but damage to Broca's area. Okay. Lateralization of the cortical functions. So this is the division of labor between the two hemispheres. Okay, so we're talking about the cortex, right and left hemispheres. They have a difference between the division of labor, yet they have to work together. So we have what we would say dominant categorical hemisphere. So dominant being defined as the language dominant hemisphere. So this doesn't mean like, oh, you're a right brain person because of how you think about stuff, and you're a left brain person because you do it this way, you know, you're more artsy fartsy versus more mathematically inclined. That's not what this is talking about. Dominant means where is the language center. So this is where is Wernicke's and Broca's area stored. It is not bilateral. So you don't have Wernicke's and Broca's both on the right and the left hemisphere. You have it more on the one hemisphere versus the other. So dominant categorical hemisphere, we're talking about language dominance. You're also talking about mathematics. You're talking about logic. Okay, so for example, to compose a sentence, balancing a checkbook, people don't really balance checkbooks anymore, memorizing a list, being able to do math problems, that type of thing would depend. Now, if we're talking about non-dominant representation of the hemisphere, this is mainly like the art or music appreciation, emotions, visual, spatial type skills, intuition, and imagination. Okay, so typically the, what is it that I want to say? 95% of the population is left categorical dominant, which, so we're saying this is mainly a left hemisphere versus the non-dominant 5%-ish would be on the right side as being a non-dominant side. Which side then, the left or the right, would have Wernicke's area on it? It would be on the dominant side, and if we're saying 95% of the population is left categorical dominant, then it would mean the left hemisphere would have Wernicke's and Broca's side on it. So that's mainly what we're talking about. So again, 95% of the population is left categorical dominant, so 5% would be right. So that 5% of the population where the right side is the dominant side would mean that Wernicke's would be on their right side. Okay, that's what we're talking about it being language dominant. So just as an aside, right categorical dominant, if they're that 5% of the population, often are left-handed and male, but it doesn't mean that a left-handed male is only a right dominant brain. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's not like a all or nothing on that sense. It's just saying typically what they found was that. Let's talk about the cerebral white matter. So this is deep or beneath the gray matter. This is where the axons are. So when we talked about axons, axons are myelinated. So myelinated axons, that's what made it white, correct? And let's see, we have commissural fibers. So what we're talking about there are the axons connect the gray areas between the two hemispheres. So these are areas that help bridge across. They make connections from right to left side, left to right side. Information has to go back and forth. And so the largest commissure that you have, or highway if you want to call it, the bridge between them, is the corpus callosum. So that's your largest commissure. Association fibers, these connect the gray areas within the same hemisphere, okay, versus projection fibers connect the brain to the rest of the body. So these are going to be your ascending or descending fibers. Remember, ascending is sensory and input. Descending would be your effector or motor output fibers. So projection fibers are connecting the brain to the rest of the body. Association fibers are connecting the gray areas within the same hemisphere, so it would be both on the left side, say, and then you have your corpus callosum or the commissural fibers, which are connecting right to left side of the hemisphere, okay? So a lot of this, again, you just got to go over the terminology, make these associations yourself. That's what's kind of fascinating about this, is we're all talking about all these associations and memory and information and how do we access it, and that's exactly what you're learning about right now. If we look at the basal nuclei, so all of this stuff that we're talking about here has to do with your cerebral cortex. That's the main category we're talking about. We're going through the different areas of it, different functions of it. We're in the white matter. Now we're going to talk about the basal nuclei. So nuclei, you guys know, is really talking about where the neural cell bodies are. The cell bodies are gray matter. The axons are the white matter, correct? So when you're looking at basal nuclei, you're talking about the nucleus is a cluster of neuron cell bodies within the brain, white matter. So we're in white matter, but now we have the basal nuclei within it. So these are essentially darker spots where the nuclei are, and the basal nuclei influences the muscle movement, which is really all inhibitory. So for example, okay, so the basal nuclei, it's called basal because it's on the basal area of the cerebral hemisphere. So it's on this lower area, basal, okay? So we're looking at these kind of guys in through here. And basically, this keeps you from doing unwanted movement. That's why it says inhibitory. And there's a problem where if people have damage to this area or a type of disease process that is damaging to this area, they may have something called Huntington's disease or Huntington's chorea. Chorea means like choreography as in dance. And so these people, if they have damage to some of the basal nuclei, they are not preventing unwanted muscular movements. So thus these people will have spontaneous movements where their arms or legs might spasm out to the side, and they didn't mean to do that. So your basal nuclei, when it's functioning properly, would inhibit or prevent these spontaneous movements. But when somebody has Huntington's chorea, for example, and there's damage to this area, they do get these spasmodic flinging of the arms and legs, kind of like how Elaine dances with on Seinfeld, if anybody used to watch that. And there are even some medications that could affect your basal nuclei and cause you to have symptoms like Huntington's chorea. So, so it could not be that they actually damaged the area, but they're taking medications that's not allowing the inhibition that the basal nuclei would normally do. Let's see, what else do we want to talk about? So the nucleus, we said, are a cluster of neuron cell bodies within the brain white matter. So this is meaning that it's gray matter that's within the white matter. Neuron cell bodies, and let's see, examples would be your caudate nucleus. the putamen, I know it sounds like a weird word, and globus pallidus. So those three, so here's your putamen, here's your globus pallidus, and you guys saw the caudate nucleus, so here's caudate is right about there. I already circled this area, which was your putamen and globus pallidus, so those were neuron cell bodies or basal nuclei within your white matter, right? Okay, so that's not bad, and hopefully you guys saw those when you did your sheep brain, or if you had the frontal cut of the for the eval, then you would have named some of those areas there. Moving right along. Oh, also this area here is the diencephalon. I'll just put a D there for diencephalon area. Let's look at a couple things real quick. Here were lateral ventricles. This was your third ventricle there. You had your thalamus. This area here would have been your hypothalamus. Let's see, anything else we want to mention? Here's your corpus callosum, which were the fibers that talked back and forth between the right and left hemisphere. Also within the thalamus, you would have had an interthalamic adhesion or intermediate mass. You might have seen it either way. I can't remember which one this book used. And so if we look down at diencephalon, central core of the brain, there were three paired structures. So we had the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus, and we have the epithalamus. So let's talk about those guys for a second. With thalamus, you have the interthalamic adhesion. So this is on each side is an egg-shaped mass. That's about 80% of your diencephalon. So I know this picture may not make it appear that way, but it is 80%. So you have the interthalamic adhesion that connects the two thalamic nuclei. Okay, I'm going to scroll it up a little bit so I can write a little easier here. So the main function, FXN for function, of the thalamus is to relay sensory info or information, okay, to the cortex. So the thalamus is like the middleman. You got to go through him to get to the cortex, and so that's why we want to understand that. So this is sensory info is sorted out here, and then it would be sent to the appropriate sensory area of the cortex. So that's our middleman. You could think of it also as like the triage nurse at the ER. So sensory info comes in, patient X comes in and says, I don't feel so good and this is what's going on. And triage nurse, who is the thalamus, says, let's take a look at some of your brief symptoms and decide where we're going to send you to the mastermind, the brain cortex, into the ER, and then decide what to do with that from there. So thalamus is like the triage center. Sensory info is sorted out here and then sent to the appropriate sensory area of the cortex. If we look at the hypothalamus, hypo meaning below, so this is below the thalamus, is also caps the brain stem area. And it has the hypophysis or pituitary gland is underneath the hypothalamus, and it's connected to the hypothalamus by that stalk called the infundibulum. So we have the hypophysis, also called the pituitary, so AKA pituitary gland, connects here by the infundibulum. And you should have been able to find the infundibulum on your brain, on the sheep brain. You may not have seen the pituitary gland because a lot of times that gets torn off when you're taking the dura mater off. So you may or may not have seen it. But what kinds of things do the hypothalamus do? It does the main autonomic control center. Autonomic means sympathetic and parasympathetic activities. So this guy's super important, right? It's the center for your emotional response. So we're going to learn about the limbic system in a little bit. So this is part of that limbic system. Limbic system has everything to do with emotional responses. It also has to do with your body temperature regulation. So this is where your thermostat or set point is. Has to do with the hunger center, decides whether you are hungry and you should keep eating, or are you satiated and you no longer need to keep eating. Also for thirst and water balance. So this is what makes you decide if you're thirsty or do you need to urinate because you've been holding a lot of water. Also has to do with your sleep-wake regulation, and then also endocrine control. So that hypophysis or pituitary gland is controlled. And other glands are also controlled by hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus that then tells the endocrine system, depending on which organ you're talking about or gland, what to do next and what should they release if they release things. If we look at epithalamus, epi means upon or above. So this epithalamus is also called your pineal gland. So the pineal gland extends from the epithalamus region, and it's between the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum. So when you were looking at the dorsal side of your sheep brain and you kind of pulled the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum and you stretched it apart a little bit, you would have seen that little pineal gland. And so this produces, so PD for produces, a hormone, I'm just going to put a capital H for hormone, called melatonin. Melatonin. So melatonin is a hormone that your own body produces, and some people will take it as a supplement. And what do you guys think melatonin does? Some of you may have taken it in the past. Melatonin helps regulate, sleep-wake cycles, and mood. And if you think about it, mood makes sense because if you don't get enough sleep, you tend to be the cranky person that feels like they need more sleep, and then you're drinking a bunch of coffee or tea to try to keep yourself up and doing stuff. So, and you're probably thinking, okay, so I just said sleep-wake cycle here, but I said that the hypothalamus does it. So what is the epithalamus doing with it too? Well, the pineal gland helps regulate the sleep-wake cycle, and the hypothalamus actually regulates it. So that means the pineal gland, because it's releasing melatonin, can affect that sleep cycle. And some people, for example, will sleep better because, or not, they aren't sleeping well, so they augment it by taking more melatonin exogenously, meaning from outside their body in, than what their own body is producing. Some people could take that melatonin over the counter and it might not affect them much because maybe they're just not that sensitive to the melatonin. So again, it's the hypothalamus that does the sleep-wake regulation, but the epithalamus helps because it's releasing melatonin, and that may allow you to be more sleepy or not if you're not producing enough of it. So that's all that means, the difference between the two. Let's take a look at brainstem. So this is gray matter deep to the white matter with presence of nuclei, because nuclei are the gray matter. White matter, remember, are the axons. So in the brainstem, we have three areas that we're going to talk about: midbrain pons and medulla oblongata, which oftentimes is just shortened to medulla. So let's look at those three individual regions. And I want you guys to listen and write down what I'm talking about here. Then when we write it out and talk about it a little more, I want you to come back to this brainstem area, to the individual three parts, and try to make those associations together. So make charts, make some pictures, whatever you need to do, because this is going to seem confusing as I go through it this first time. But then when you go back to this area and you make those connections, it will, and you draw some of these diagrams out, it will start to make more sense to you. Okay, so I know this is going to seem confusing at first, but midbrain, part of the brainstem, is covered by what's called the cerebral peduncles. Cerebral, so 1L, cerebral cortex area, that's what we're talking about, which has the corticospinal tracts. Cortex, spinal cord. So the cerebral peduncles is also known as corticospinal tracts. These are descending or motor pathways because it's cortex to spinal cord, and your spinal cord then goes out to the peripheral nerves and telling your muscles or glands or whatnot what to do. Okay, I'm going to write down that this is ventrally located, and when I draw the picture, when I say ventral and dorsal, this will make more sense in a moment. So the cerebral peduncles are ventral. Okay, now on the midbrain, so we said midbrain was covered by cerebral peduncles, but of the midbrain itself, you have superior cerebellar peduncles. So cerebellar, remember, is the little extra brain, our extra CPU or central processing unit so this is not part of the cortex, right? That's why it's part of the brainstem. So cerebellar peduncles are going to talk to the cerebellum. So that's why it says tracts that connect cerebellum to midbrain. Now, when we say tracts, we are talking about the axons, okay? So tracts are the axons versus nuclei are where the gray matter, the neural cell bodies are. So these are tracts, and what do you think tracts are doing? Tracts, if they're axons, they're sending information to and from, depending on if it's ascending coming up to the cortex or descending going away from the cortex. And so sometimes we have information coming into the cerebellum and out of the cerebellum. So that would also be to and from, input, output, depending on what we're talking about. All right, so we have superior cerebellar peduncles, tracts that connect the cerebellum to the midbrain. These are dorsally located, dorsal. So I said the cerebral peduncles are ventral, the cerebellar peduncles are dorsal. And again, this will make sense in a moment, but when we draw that picture, I want you to go back to these notes and apply it and redraw the picture again so that you understand why something I put here was ventral versus something that I put here was dorsal. So these, for the cerebellar peduncles, the superior ones, these are impulses go to, impulses, so we're talking about info, right? Impulses go from the cerebellum to the motor cortex. And who do you think is the motor cortex? That's our precentral gyrus, okay? Precentral gyrus, which we'll talk about in just a second again. And how we get there are through the, we have to cross the superior cerebral peduncles to get there, okay? Through, or via, or by, however you want to say that, the superior cerebral peduncles. Okay. Now, so again, cerebral, cerebellar, we're going to talk about these words. They sound confusing. Remember, cerebellar has the 2 legs on it, LL, so that means this has a lot to do with our motor coordination, which is going to make more sense in a second. Let's continue down. So we're still talking about midbrain. So midbrain has superior cerebellar peduncles. It contains cerebral aqueduct, the CA, we talked about that. So remember, cerebral spinal fluid goes from the lateral ventricles and the 3rd and 4th ventricles. So between the 3rd and 4th ventricle are the cerebral aqueduct, or not are the, is the cerebral aqueduct. And then it leaves the 4th ventricle. Do you guys remember how we talked about this? Through the lateral and medial apertures. Those are the little holes that allow it to then get around the rest of the brain. We also have the corpora quadrigemina located on the midbrain. So corpora means body, quadrigemina, quad means 4, so these are 4 bodies. Those 4 bodies included the 2 superior colliculi and the 2 inferior colliculi. Those were what made up the 4 for the quad, for the corpora quadrigemina. So the superior colliculi have nuclei on it, which are the cell bodies, that coordinate the eyes with head movement. So what we're talking about here is if you're watching something off in the horizon, like an airplane that's flying by, and you are then going to follow it with your eyes, and at some point, you're going to have to start turning your head if you want to continue to follow it. Okay, so your eyes can only go so far, so this is coordinating that. Or let's say you're playing sports, so this could be a baseball or a football that gets thrown, or you're playing tennis, and it has to do with your eye movement and coordinating the eyes with the head movement, so eyes and muscular movement of the head. The inferior colliculi has to do with auditory reflexes. So this is the startle reflex. So for example, you have a loud sound, something crashes, some plate breaks, it drops, a gunshot, a car backfires, whatever it is, would give you a startle reflex where all of a sudden this is where you're going to make that connection. Okay, so you hear something, it startles you, and immediately you will look towards where you heard that sound. That's what the inferior colliculi have to do with. Let's see. So also in the midbrain, we have some nuclei involved with skeletal muscle control. Okay. So for example, we have something called the substantia nigra. Nigra, typically you might refer back to being very dark colored. So substantia nigra are the nuclei that connect to the basal nuclei. So the reason why they are so darkly pigmented is because they contain melanin. So contain melanin. You guys heard about melanin before when we talked about skin pigmentation, yes? Or even iris pigmentation, okay? So melanin is a very dark colored pigment, or can be depending on what is produced. But in this area, it is very darkly pigmented. And the precursor to melanin, okay, so precursor, what came before it, is, sorry, let me say that again. So you have melanin. Melanin is a precursor of something that we already talked about, which is, so it's a precursor to dopamine, which we talked about dopamine, right? So dopamine, remember, is a neurotransmitter, and we said that something else was a precursor to dopamine, and that was tyrosine. So melanin comes from tyrosine. So you have tyrosine, you can make melanin from it, and then from melanin you could then make dopamine. See, there we go. Also, let's see, we can have Parkinsonism, like Parkinson's disease. So Parkinsonism. All right, so Parkinsonism basically is the being able to differentiate, being able to have proper movement coordination, and they can have something called a resting tremor. So when they're not trying to do something, they're not reaching for something, they will have where the hand looks like it's shaking or vibrating a little bit there. And they also can have rigidity as well, and so very stiff appearance. And so if you are having problems with your substantia nigra, you could have Parkinsonism, Parkinson's disease, just kind of depends to what degree something's going on with and the damage. Also, we can have with our midbrain, we do have also a red nucleus. So this is motor relay to descending pathways. The reason we call it red is because when you cut into the fresh brain, if you will, and you're at the midbrain area, you would see the red nucleus, and the reason it's red is because it is rich in blood vessels. So rich in BV for blood vessels. And it also has neurons, lots of neurons. And so because of all of the blood in the area, it has contains iron pigment, which also makes it red. Contains iron pigment with the neurons, okay? So that's the midbrain. Again, you have superior cerebellar peduncles, you have the cerebral aqueduct in that area, corpora quadrigemina, you have substantia nigra and red nucleus, which have to do with your skeletal muscle control. And now let's look at the pons. So this is another area of the brainstem. It's a bridge between the midbrain and the medulla. So we have sensory and motor fibers, or fiber tracts. I'll take the S off of fibers there because now it just looks weird. So we have sensory and motor fiber tracts. Remember, tracts are the axons, right? That pass through this area, this bridge. I know that's not how you spell through, but we're just going to do that easily. And this helps the medulla, or medulla oblongata, with parts of respiratory control. So it's not responsible for your breathing, but it does help with the respiratory pattern of breathing. Okay, so it's not responsible for your breathing. We're going to find that that has to do with the medulla oblongata itself. So, but it does help modulate or help the medulla oblongata with parts of respiratory control. In the pons, we have the middle cerebellar peduncles. So 2 L's, legs. So this is talking about the cerebellum. So this is going to relay impulses from the motor cortex and it's going to come into the cerebellum. Okay, so it basically is going to notify the cerebellum that voluntary activity has been initiated. Voluntary means skeletal muscle, right? That voluntary activity has been initiated. Okay. So, for example, the middle cerebellar peduncles, you can think of it as an input track. It's bringing information into the cerebellum, okay, through the middle cerebellar peduncles. If we look at the medulla oblongata, this blends into the spinal cord, or will become that. We have the inferior cerebellar peduncles, okay, and these are on the dorsal side, which again, I'll talk about dorsal and ventral in a moment. And the inferior cerebellar peduncles will bring sensory impulses, so sensory info, to the cerebellum. Okay. This is telling your body, basically your body position sense. So if you had your eyes closed, you know right now where your hands are in relationship to the rest of your body. You know where your feet are in relationship to the rest of your body. If you weren't afraid of tripping or falling, you know it's a flat surface in front of you, you could close your eyes and walk and understand where your body parts are in relationship to the rest of your body. That's what position sense is. That's what we're talking about here. But on the ventral side, so the inferior cerebellar peduncles are dorsal, but on the ventral side of the medulla oblongata, so ventral side, so I'll put an arrow there for you. On the ventral side of medulla oblongata are what are called the motor pyramids. Okay, so these are those corticospinal tracts that we talked about a little earlier. This is where crossover occurs. So remember crossover. And another name for that is decussate, D-E-C-U-S-S-A-T-E, decussate occurs. So do you guys remember where we said the right hemisphere of the cortex controls the left side of your body, like left hand, left foot, and vice versa? That's where the crossover is occurring. So the information from the left hand or left foot is coming into the body, and it will cross to the right side of the brain here at the medulla oblongata. That's what decussate means, and this is occurring right here on the ventral side, okay? So what else do I want to tell you? The medulla is also the base where all of the control centers are for like very important control centers. So we have here the cardiac center, which controls the heart rate and the force of contraction of your heart. We have the vasomotor center, which regulates your blood pressure. You have the respiratory center. Remember we said medulla oblongata actually controls respiration. So here we go. This controls the rate and the depth. And remember the other guy, the pons, was helping the medulla with parts of respiration but didn't control it. The medulla controls it. Okay, but the medulla also has specialized respiratory activities. So for example, if you cough, sneeze, vomit, or hiccup, you have to breathe differently so you don't die when those kind of things happen. You don't want to die or cause a huge problem every time you cough, sneeze, vomit, or hiccup, right? So this is, the medulla helps control that and has that specialized ability to do that when we have those accessory ways of needing to breathe, essentially. All right, so that was the cortex. Now let's talk about the cerebellum, and then some of the things that we just talked about with the brainstem for the midbrain, pons, and medulla will make sense when it's talking to the cerebellum. So cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain. You could think of this as your CPU or an additional central processing unit. So this is like an extra computer for your cortex, okay? It does fine control over muscle action. So fine control over little m is muscle action. So it's talking about skeletal muscle here. It also stores memories of movement pattern. Okay, so when you're thinking muscle memory, when somebody says, oh, muscle memory, and you're playing basketball and you want to get better at it, and so you practice doing layups kind of slow, you practice doing them fast, you practice them from the right side of the court, the left side of the court, and you put it all together, that's muscle memory, so that you don't have to think about it. And most people talk about muscle memory in response to sport type activities and stuff, of practice, 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 so that you don't have to consciously think about what you're doing, you just go through the motions of it, your muscles take over. Well, really it's your cerebellum. It is remembering these patterns and is taking over. So the cerebellum is divided into hemispheres also. There's a right and a left. The cerebellar processing steps. Let's talk about that, and then we're going to talk about this diagram that I just drew. So you have the frontal motor cortex, which initiates voluntary activity. So that means it's sending information. So this is input to the cerebellum by via the middle cerebellar peduncles. Middle cerebellar, I'm just going to PED for peduncles, not pediatrics, okay? At the same time, the cerebellum is receiving body position sensory information. So this is input also, okay, via or by sensory, so that means the inferior cerebellar peduncles, okay? And then the cerebellum calculates the best way to contract your muscles to achieve the desired activity. So it's going to kind of smooth things out here by information that it's getting back and forth. Now impulses will leave the cerebellum, so now we're talking about output, right? Leaves the cerebellum to the frontal motor cortex with precise muscle control instructions, and it does this via or by the superior cerebral or cerebellar peduncles. There we go, cerebellar peduncles, okay? So I drew this picture here so you guys can pause it and draw what I drew out. So basically on the bottom left, I drew my brain stem in this area here. Then I drew a cerebellum and I put the word processing in the center because I told you this is like a processing area. It's going to decide what to do. And then I drew, I know it totally doesn't look like a cerebrum, but I drew this guy here because he's supposed to be larger and bigger. That's our cerebrum. Then I drew a central sulcus, which is this line right here, because then you guys know in front of that or anterior to that is the precentral gyrus. And thus posterior to that would be your post-central gyrus. Remember, post-central had to do with sensory, but right now I want to talk about how do we process this muscle pattern that we want to have happen. So that's what we're talking about, precentral gyrus here. All right, so real quick, let's say this again. The cerebellum is connected to the brainstem by 3 pairs of stalks called cerebellar peduncles. You have the inferior peduncle that connects to the medulla oblongata. So here is our inferior cerebellar peduncle, okay? Then we have a middle cerebellar peduncle, that's in the middle there, and that connects to the pons, okay? And then we have the superior peduncle, which connects to the midbrain. So that's why I wrote medulla oblongata, pons, and midbrain there. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. I'm going to erase some of my arrows so that you guys don't get confused by them on why I put this extra stuff here, because I did list out the names for you. And we'll leave the rest. Okay, this looks good. Now, most spinal input enters the cerebellum by the inferior peduncles. Most input from the rest of the brain is going to enter the middle peduncle. That's why we said middle and inferior were both input areas. So that's what I was talking about here and here. And then the cerebellar output going out, okay, that's the output part of it, is by the superior peduncle. So I just wanted to point that out real quick before I move on here. Now, I'm going to use a couple different colors here. So if we want to actually have a physical, I'll keep it on a thin black line. So this black line I'm saying is the motor output. So after you've decided what to do, you're going to send information from the precentral gyrus to the effector muscle or some other part of your body. And so I'm going to put here, this is where I'm coming from my precentral gyrus. I'm going to come along the body here, and I'm going to send that effector descending input out down the spinal cord and then out to the appropriate muscle, whatever it ends up being, okay? So that's why I said black is the motor output there. That's the end goal of what we're doing. Now, before that happens, let's come back and see what these steps are in order to get that to occur. So I'm going to take red. Come on. Red is our sensory input. So you got some sort of sensory input. So it's coming into your body. And we said this sensory input is going to go up the inferior cerebellar peduncle, okay? It's going to get processed by the cerebellum, and he's going to decide what we need to do. Now, he's going to then also get information, and I'm going to go with green here. He's going to get information from the motor input area. So the precentral gyrus is going to say, hey, guess what, cerebellum? I'm initiating a movement. So that's this guy here, and he's going to send his info. We want to go to the middle cerebellar peduncle and get processed there. So these are your two inputs. Input into the cerebellum from sensory, from the outside things. Input from the precentral gyrus, telling you that you're initiating a movement, and it's going to talk to the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is going to use that information and decide what the appropriate response should be to fine-tune this information. And so he's then going to send, and this is going to be my blue line, he's going to send information output, meaning output from the cerebellum, and he's going to send it via the superior peduncle to your precentral gyrus to tell it what to do. And then you could make your arc at that point to your black motor output line that we put there and send the appropriate response then. And it's going to continue to talk to each other. You're constantly going to get input information in. The cerebellum is going to process it and fine tune it and say, hey, you need to use a little more force behind that muscle contraction so that way we have, we're able to pick that up. Oh, hey, you used too much force with that. Slow it down, buddy. We don't need that much input on that part. So basically, let's review what that meant. And here was the dorsal sides. Let me put it back in black again. So dorsal, that's why we kept saying dorsal input and output. Here's ventral. So now I want you guys to go back to the information that I just did here for cerebellum. I want you to reread that with this information, with this diagram. Then I want you to go all the way back to where I talked about earlier And that way you can put that info together again and see what makes sense to you. But let me go over this picture one last time. So in the earlier lectures, we talked about cerebral and cerebellar peduncles. Peduncle just means like feet and stuff. So the cerebral peduncles are on the ventral aspect. So remember we said the midbrain was covered by the cerebral peduncle. Okay, so that's out here kind of covering this up. But we also have cerebellar peduncles, and those are on the dorsal aspects. Dorsal, dorsal, dorsal aspect, right? And in this cartoon drawing, which was really a bad drawing, but it gets the point across, you have two neuron cell bodies in the precentral gyrus. So that's what we're talking about here and here, right? In the cerebellum is your processing info coming into it. So remember, the medulla oblongata has the inferior cerebellar peduncle. That was that guy right there. And he takes the sensory information coming in from your body and gives this information to the cerebellum, which is depicted by that red line there. This is also afferent or ascending sensory information. What else is coming into the cerebellum? So then we have our green line, which is from the precentral gyrus. So we have skeletal muscle activity that we're going to initiate. So that goes to the cerebellum with our sensory info, and we process this info and decide what we need to do. Then you're going to have your cerebellum output, which is the blue line. It sends information to the precentral gyrus. It's sending additional info about additional neurons that need to be activated in order to carry out the activity. So the cerebellum is helping to fine-tune that information to better finesse the movement or motor activity. So we initiate the voluntary activity, we receive the sensory information, then the cerebellum calculates the best way to achieve that movement or ability, and then the information goes to the precentral gyrus with the info to fine-tune the movement. So the cerebellum is kind of like autopilot on a plane. It compares the plane's instrument reading panels with the planned course of what your brain says, I'm going to go do this, and then it's always getting this information back and forth, and then the body's performance is also going to be compared, and the brain's intentions, and it's going to send out that information and messages to initiate the appropriate corrective measures. So, you were flying too high, and then the autopilot says, oh, we need to bring it down a little bit. That's what your cerebellum is doing there, okay? And so, real quick, again, go through that information. Here we have a picture. Oh, so what are we talking about here? We got our, this is called a histology drawing. That's what I'm trying to say. Sorry about that, guys. So our histology drawing, so in the cerebellum, you have Purkinje cells. Remember, in the cerebrum, you have pyramidal cells. So this is cerebellum. So that's why we have Purkinje cells here, okay? And these neurons are big, and the Purkinje cells are easiest to find if you go to the junction between the gray and the white matter of the cerebellum. And so here were your Purkinje cells here. These guys, those were the bodies, okay? Do you guys remember the white matter that you guys saw on the cerebellum? That was your arbor vitae, yeah? And so let's see, what else do we want to do? We can talk about the functional brain system real quick. So there are two functional systems of the brain that we'll look at. That's the limbic system and the reticular formation. So with the limbic system, okay, so several brain areas surrounding the brain stem. So this is called your emotional brain. Okay. And it has tight communications with other areas of the cerebral cortex. I'm just going to put cortex so you guys know that. Okay. And it allows emotions to override your reason. So you're probably thinking like, well, that may not make much sense. But for example, if you had your child and you have this emotional connection, obviously, to your child. Most people do. I guess not everybody, but most people would. And if your kid's about to fall off the cliff, you might throw your body and try to grab your kid, even if it means you might go over that cliff yourself, but you saved your child. So you have these mechanisms in your brain that say, don't do something that might allow yourself to die. But your limbic system, the emotional brain, will override that in order to save something you had a huge emotional attachment to, okay? So that's what we're talking about here. Or like your kid's about to step out in front of a car and you dive across, shove the kid out of the way, and you get hit in the process. You know that you could be hit and die, but you do it anyway because your limbic system says, wait, I have an emotional connection and I'm going to fix this. All right, so that's what it's talking about. And it has outputs to and from the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus. Okay. And so this also has to do with psychosomatic illnesses. Psychosomatic, Attic insane. Just kidding. Psychosomatic illness. So a psychosomatic illness means psycho meaning psychological, a brain thought pattern. Somatic is with your body or your organs. So for example, you could, you know, an upcoming test is coming up, you start to feel ill about it, you start getting stomach aches, it's starting to get worse and worse, you're feeling horrible, you really think you're coming down with the stomach bug or something, and you go home and you skip the test or whatever, and then you realize you weren't really ill. You had nothing wrong with you physically that you realized. But psychosomatic illnesses can also be physical. And so when people say, oh, it's all in your head, well, it is. You could have some huge loss, you know, lose a significant other, a loved one, even pets, you know, it all is the same kind of feelings. This is your emotional brain. And you could end up with loss of appetite, sleep disturbances where you can't sleep or you're sleeping too much. And it's because you have this emotional feelings towards this, and then it ends up causing physical problems with your body. So people say, oh, it's all in your head. Well, yes, it is. So again, very primitive area of the brain. It's important for our survival. Also, odors could trigger an emotional response. So you could be going along and you can smell like skunk and realize that's a bad repulsive smell, or it might be a perceived threat that you realize from somebody's facial expressions, and you have memory of this, that when somebody's looking at you really funky, or sneering at you or very angry looking, that you might want to not be near that person because you know that on some level something's going on and you need to get away from that smell or that facial expression or whatever. You have a primitive response to protecting yourself. So that's the limbic system that we're talking about there. Let's see. And then reticular formation. Let's talk about that here, and then when we come back on Tuesday, I'll review limbic and reticular formation. But reticular formation extends through the central core of the brainstem, and reticular activating center, or RAS, this is all of our input or sensory passes through the RAS. So all sensory info coming in goes through or passes through the RAS. The reticular activating system, RAS, okay, before reaching the cortex. This is what keeps your cortex stimulated, keeps cortex stimulated, which basically means it keeps us conscious. So as long as the RAS is active and sending signals to the cortex, then we are conscious, awake, aware, okay? But if the RAS stops sending those signals, then we lose consciousness. So when you go to sleep, the sleep centers in the hypothalamus are shutting down the RAS. So RAS shutdown occurs, meaning the cortex shuts down and we're unconscious, you're out. For example, also like boxing, if somebody gets hit in the head, and it twists the brainstem, and all of a sudden you lose consciousness, it's because it disrupted the RAS from sending signals, thus you lost consciousness. So kind of fascinating how that works. And then it acts as a filter for familiar signals. So 99% of the stimuli is filtered out. So 99% of stimuli is filtered out. Okay, so filters out from the conscious awareness. So you're only aware of about 1% of the stimuli. And what that means is, so if you put your clothes on today and your shirt is brushing your arm, and so for a minute there you're going, shirt's touching my arm, shirt's touching my arm, shirt's touching my arm. And the RAS says, that's all good, but I don't really have to pay attention that the shirt is touching my arm. I think we can dampen that information out. I don't need to keep sending that to the cortex right now. And it says, but it allows unusual stimuli to reach consciousness. Okay, so you're not aware of something like the seat hardness that you're sitting in, your shirt sleeve touching you, the person sitting right next to you, until I said it, and then it brought your brain to think about those things, right? Like, so when I said your shirt's touching you, all of you probably started thinking, oh yeah, my shirt is touching me. I just now realized that. Although you really were aware of it at some level, but you didn't have to know it for everything. And this is all designed basically to prevent sensory overload. So what that means is you don't have to understand all this stuff is going on, but now all of a sudden something unusual stimulates it, and then it needs to reach your consciousness. So you didn't need to know about the shirt. You didn't need to know about the shirt. RAS is filtering that out, saying, I don't need to tell the cortex. You don't need to be aware of that. And then all of a sudden a bug lands on your arm and stings you. That really hurts and potentially could be detrimental to your life depending on what the bug is and what it's doing to you. And so all of a sudden your RAS says, holy moly, something just bit me or touched me. That's what allows an unusual stimulus to still break through what you had been filtering out on your arm or your skin at that time. So let's end there. I want you guys to review the cerebrum and the cerebellum and the picture that I drew there. We'll come back and talk about briefly the limbic system and reticular formation when we come back, and then we'll go on to brainwave patterns in the EEG. And on Tuesday, we will finish up the information for the exam for material. So, all right, go back and review all this stuff that I talked about there. Have a great spring break. I will talk to you guys later.